Good morning. Welcome to Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice Daily Press Conference. My name is Rachita. I'm the Global Coordinator of DCJ. I think we all know that we are towards the end of this COP, and increasingly, this so-called finance COP we are seeing is becoming nearly a bankrupt COP. Today's press conference is actually focused on who are the real blockers of a COP29 outcome. So we have been seeing the narrative that increasingly the blame is being trying to shift to the global south countries. But after nearly 30 years of COP, we are quite surprised that we still have to come here and keep reiterating that it's actually very few countries, very rich countries, that who have been historically responsible for this crisis are also the ones polluting the process inside. So we'll start first with this very powerful panel who will just break down essentially on how this is happening. We'll start with Brandon Wu from ActionAid USA.
Thank you, Rachita. So again, just to reiterate, this press conference is about who are the real blockers. We're entering the stage of the COP where there's going to be some finger pointing and blame if things don't deliver an outcome that everybody is happy with, which of course seems very unlikely at this point. And the developed countries, in particular the United States, always like to point the finger, especially at some of the larger developing countries, saying, oh, they are refusing to take action to reduce emissions. They are the reason this process isn't going anywhere. This is an incredibly hypocritical stance for the world's largest historical emitter and one of the world's richest countries to be taking. Needless to say, the United States has not delivered anywhere close to its fair share of climate finance, and the reason that developing countries are hesitant to make concrete commitments is because there is no trust that any finance will be available to actually implement those commitments. And so the onus really lies on the developed countries, the United States, and others to actually deliver that finance, or at least negotiate in good faith and make some indications that the finance will be forthcoming in order to enable progress in the negotiations. So not only is the United States not providing any money, they're actually working actively to undermine the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal. For example, trying to water down the language so that there's actually no responsibility, there's no obligation for developed countries. It's all about mobilizing the private sector. Oh, and let's see if we can get China to contribute some money. So everything the United States is doing, even now, with the Biden administration knowing that the Trump administration is coming into power, they have nothing to lose, and even now, all they're doing is blocking and obstructing and distracting. So I know folks probably have some interest in the new text that came out, so I'll just turn briefly to some of the specific text. The top line is that there's no number. We came to this COP, the finance COP, for a number, a new collective goal on climate finance. It's 2 days from the end of the COP. There's still no number. The G77 developing countries have put forward a number that they want to see, 1.3 trillion. The developed countries have refused to even engage with that and propose a counter to that. We've seen rumors in the media, but there's been nothing concrete from developed countries. They're not negotiating in good faith. So the fact that there is not a single number in the NCQG text that we just saw this morning, Thursday of week 2, is an indication that the developed countries are not serious. There are some options in there that are clearly preferred by developed countries. And again, no number, nothing specific. Their preference is a big, meaningless target. Again, not specified how big, but it could be big. And they'd be okay with that because it's meaningless. It's about scaling up global finance. There's actually no direction of flow in one of their proposals. It's nothing about money flowing from developed countries to developing countries. It just says we should increase the scale of global investment on climate change, including domestic resource mobilization in developing countries. And so then we would be counting what developing countries are doing domestically towards a global climate finance goal. It's an absolute joke. They're not being serious. I think the other thing I would point out is the emphasis on private finance, on investment. Again, a big part of this push is coming from the United States. They're saying we have to look at the private sector. That's where all the money is. This is the same country that spends almost $1 trillion per year on its military budget. They're not being serious. And so if you see anyone saying that the developing countries are blocking, that's insulting. Because the developed countries are putting literally nothing on the table here, and that's compounding on the fact that they've failed to meet existing obligations for years and years.
Thank you so much, Brandon. We'll now hear from Colin Rees of Oil Change International.
Thank you, Rachita. As mentioned, my name is Colin Rees. I'm the United States campaign manager with Oil Change International. And I think it's important to recognize that in addition to the lack of finance that's been provided by the United States in particular, and by the global north at this COP, we've also seen a lack of follow through on mitigation and on fossil fuel phase out. We came out of Dubai last year with an insufficient but important signal that the world was planning to transition away from fossil fuels. That transition needs to be led by the global north, both because they have more capacity to do so and because, as I'll detail, they are a huge part of the problem, arguably the overwhelming part of the problem, and we have not seen follow through. In my own country, in the United States, we've seen Joe Biden continue to permit fossil fuel expansion, refuse to crack down on the fossil fuel industry despite some renewable subsidies, some important steps forward there, but not actually tackling the core driver of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. That pattern has continued here in the halls of COP, as we've even seen these same global north countries gaslighting other countries saying, we want more mitigation. That problem needs to start at home. It's enormous hypocrisy from the global north and the US in particular to claim lack of action toward a fossil fuel phase out when we are the ones driving so much of that problem. The United States is currently the world's largest producer, exporter, and expander of oil and gas. So not only are we the world's largest producer of both oil and gas, we're also exporting the most by far, and we're continuing to expand that extraction, devastating the Permian Basin, the Bakken Shale, other regions of the United States subject to this fossil fuel extraction, and to ship that overseas to continue to hook other countries on our fossil fuels for decades to come. The United States alone is responsible for 1/3 of the world's planned expansion of oil and gas in the next 25 years, according to an Oil Change International report just last year called Planet Wreckers. I am not proud as a United States citizen to say that we are the planet wrecker in chief. And that is, I think, core to understanding a lot of the problems here at COP is just how deeply states like the United States, also others like Canada, Australia, are truly petrostates in the term of the word that is often used to describe other states, but these are the countries driving oil and gas expansion and refusing to not only do their fair share on finance, but also not remotely do their fair share on mitigation and phase out. Just 5 countries, the United States, Canada, Norway, Australia, and the UK, are responsible for over 1/2, for 51% of planned oil and gas expansion through 2050 in the next 25 years. As I mentioned, much of this fossil fuel expansion is for export. It's being used as a geopolitical ploy. It's very cynical. They are desperately working to lock in long-term contracts in other countries, long past when we know we can afford to be burning fossil fuels, but they're forcing countries and helping private companies to lock in 20, 30, 40-year LNG export contracts, for instance, even though these countries might only need gas for 5 or 10 more years. So, returning a bit to COP29 here, to the text that we've seen, there are still some options on the table, but there's a huge amount of ambition missing on mitigation and on fossil fuel phase out. It's incredibly important that we see a stronger outcome in mitigation, But I will say it's not a surprise given the lack of action domestically in many of these large polluters. So that's the hypocrisy piece. And it's also not a surprise given the lack of concrete finance commitments on the table. We've known from day one that finance and mitigation are deeply connected. That's more clear than ever at this COP as we see those two work streams sort of held up and in limbo, pretending to wait on the other, but I think really finance is the key here, as Brandon has laid out, and we'll hear more. I think it's fair to say the Global North's lack of progress on fossil fuel phase-out sends a really terrible signal to other countries about how to interpret the Dubai outcome, how to interpret paragraph 28 and the idea that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. As I mentioned, it was not the ideal outcome. It's not a justice-based outcome that many of us were pushing for, but if implemented strongly, there's something to work with there. What we're seeing so far is that the US and other Global North leaders are not interpreting that paragraph in a good way, are not following through with good intentions to actually phase out fossil fuels. And so I think you see some other countries saying, well, the world's largest producers and expanders, the biggest hypocrites here, are not following through on their own phase out. They're also not providing the finance, at least not yet, which will be required for us to be able to make this change. So I'll just close and say that fossil finance is what is going to, or a finance commitment of high quality public grants-based trillions in finance is what can unlock a fossil fuels that phase out for much of the world.
Thank you so much, Colin. We'll now hear from Nina De Peter from Friends of the Earth, Netherlands.
Thank you. I'm from the Friends of the Earth from the Netherlands, and I want to start by quoting the court that said a week ago, "There can be no doubt that protection from dangerous climate change is a human right." For the court, there is no doubt that the climate problem is the greatest issue of our time. Climate change damages the rights protected by Article 2 and 8 in the European Convention for Human Rights, both in the Netherlands and abroad, and will damage them even further. A similar statement was made by the judges of the European Court of Justice about 7 months ago. And I kind of have the feeling that although you cannot misinterpret these words, countries from the EU forgot about them in this COP. Instead of taking the responsibility that the EU has towards the rest of the world, they frustrate the negotiations and refuse to pay up. The historical and current emissions of the EU leaves them with an enormous debt towards the global south. And instead of paying up and increasing the grants that the EU should increase, we see them pushing for private funds and loans. Private money is not the answer, and it makes the problem even worse. Companies will always prioritize profit over people, exactly like the EU is doing right now. It is inappropriate that the EU keeps calling itself a front runner, while over half of the climate money raised so far are loans and other non-grant types of finance, which leads to even greater debts in the global south. When it comes to public funds, the EU is silent. We already heard it from one of the other speakers. And although there is no official word from the EU itself, words on the street is that the EU negotiators are floating a seriously underwhelming quantum, about 200 to 300 billion annually. And just to make it clear, when you account for inflation, that would mean that there's no additional public finance compared to the goal set years ago. Climate finance and mitigation go hand in hand. Rich countries cannot expect countries from the global south to increase their ambition on mitigation. The global south that did not cause the climate crisis in the first place. And they cannot increase their ambitions if the same rich countries do not pay their fair share. And to go back to these human rights, basic human rights are not something nice to brag about when you put them in a convention. They come with an obligation, and it's time for the EU to pay up and also take its responsibility.
Thank you so much, Nina. We'll now hear from Asad Rehman from War on Want.
Thank you, Rashida. My name is Asad Rehman from War on Want, and we are heading towards, of course, the end of COP29 and the very future of the planet and its people continue to hang in the balance. And let's be absolutely clear as to who the real blockers are in this process, as you've heard. Who are the arsonists who burn down other people's homes, then walk away from the flames, leaving the victim to rebuild on their own? Who are the real climate criminals whose fingerprints are over the killer droughts and famines, the deadly heat waves and floods that are destroying people's lives and livelihoods, and overwhelming the capacity of developing countries to protect their citizens? And who are they, these people, who are pushing the obligation for domestic mobilization onto them? Like emperors with no clothes, countries such as the UK and other developed countries are all great at making grand speeches about climate leadership, about keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and pointing the fingers at others. And we've got to be absolutely clear. The global stocktake outcome clearly stated that we're already consumed 4/5 of the carbon budget for a 50% chance of limiting temperatures below 1.5. And as you heard from the other panelists, the report card of rich developed countries, it doesn't give any of them an A star. In fact, they should be in detention, be made to write out, "I will do better." The synthesis of the biannual report of parties, which is already included in the Annex 1 to the Convention, noted that the emissions of rich developed countries will be 0.5% higher by 2030 than they reported in 2020. Incredible, talking about cutting emissions of others whilst increasing their own emissions. And I want to say about the UK, about making a bold statement here about a new NDC, of cutting emissions by 81% by 2035 on 1990 levels. But when you lift the lid, it's always a different story. Include international aviation, include shipping, include territorial emissions and consumption emissions, and the reality is we're at a minus 20% emission reduction by 1990. That's a tiny 0.6% each and every year. And instead of cutting domestic emissions or providing real climate finance, we're handing over 28 billion to risky and unproven technologies such as carbon capture and storage, literally a license to continue to pollute for the fossil fuel giants. And whilst the UK can stand here and say, we will not be issuing any new fossil fuel licenses, they of course won't say that they're going to revoke the 100 new licenses that were granted in 2024, enough to double the UK's total country emissions by itself. And of course, we don't hear anything about the taxpayer handouts that go to the fossil fuel companies. In the UK, 84% tax rebate for the new oil and gas giants, whilst of course literally nothing. No wonder the fossil fuel giants are all laughing the way to the bank as they bank 120 billion in profit. What matters, of course, is leadership and targets and action now. And I want to say, if the UK wants to show its fair leadership, its fair share of the carbon budget would be minus 200% by 2030 with real zero targets. So not only would they have to decarbonize by 2030, they would have to provide 1 trillion in finance just to end their free riding of mitigation effort. That's why when civil society calls for the 5 trillion, we say it doesn't even scratch the surface of what is looted and what is owed to the global south. The US, UK, European Union, Japan and Australia will need to double or even triple their NDCs. And of course, let me just finally end on the climate, on finance. The UK has pledged 11.6 billion in climate finance to the global south. Look, it's already 40% behind its existing target. Its annual contributions between 2021 and 2023 decreased. And even now, it would need to double that effort to meet its existing obligation. And of course, it continues to redirect its own foreign aid budget to meet its domestic expenditure. If they want to show leadership, its leadership is on the quantum, the figure. It's on the quality. It's on public finance. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of UK citizens have called on Ed Miliband to take some concrete steps here. And I want to just outline some very simple steps that the UK could take. The UK has enabled 102 billion in tax dodging of multinationals this year. The UK and its overseas territories are responsible for 1/4 of global tax dodging. back the UN Tax Convention, use that money to pay for the climate finance that's needed. The super rich, who are responsible for half of all the post-1990 emissions increase and are projected to be responsible for 16% of all global emissions by 2030. The ones who've grabbed 2/3 of global wealth, 43 trillion in the last 2 years alone, back a wealth tax on them and redirect that money to the climate finance and the quantum that is needed. The UK and, as you've heard, all of the rich developed countries seem to find no problem in finding public finance to increase military expenditure. No problem finding the finance for the bombs that are raining down on Gaza and other places. Redirect that military spending to public finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad. And our panelists will now take questions from the floor, prioritizing media. If you have questions, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and ask your question.
Thank you so much. My name is Amakodi Cyrus Kabale. I'm from Uganda, where Total and Sunoco are developing the ECOP project. I'm one of the ECOP affected person. Today, I'm hearing that we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels in the global north. But these companies that are developing fossil fuels, they are already opening up new ones in our countries. For example, Total, as I'm speaking today, there are more exploration that are being done in our countries. And with the human rights violations, the environmental violations that are happening within our communities that are going unreported, we are here suffering, and today we are here on the platform. How can we help us to voice out our voices in the communities? Because these companies, we know they have a lot of money, they use a lot of money, and they are dividing us in the communities. They are threatening us, and we are being arrested day and night. So how can you help us to see that our voices can be heard at international level? Because we know there's nothing being done in our country. The media is our local media.
Can I just ask, can you ask a very specific question, because we have 2 more questions coming.
How can you help us to voice out our community voices so that they can be heard by the international?
Okay, thank you. And can we also take the second question now?
Thank you very much. My name is Hilary Omondi from Kenya. And from the conversations that are being made in this room, it is clear that there is no direction as to concern to commitments on issues of climate financing. So my question is, now what is the role of international organizations? I'm seeing Friends of the Earth, Netherlands here, and other big organizations. What are you now, what is the direction that you are taking to ensure that we get the right share in terms of climate financing from this particular engagement? Thank you.
Thank you. We can take one more question before we go to the panelists.
My name is Lala. My question is, what was the key factors in failure to mention the transition from fossil fuel in G20s?
Thank you. Asad? Do you want to start, Brandon? No, Asad, go ahead. You go ahead. Yes.
Maybe to start with your question about international organizations, I think it's key that we work together within these kind of networks, such as Friends of the Earth International, and especially with Friends of the Earth International, our goal is to put the voices of those who are affected most by climate change forward. And the reason why I am sitting here right now is because I'm from a European Union country, and we see that the European Union is not taking its responsibility, is not doing what it should be doing concerning the historical emissions and the fair share that the EU should be paying. but most importantly is that I listen to those voices within our network, within Friends of the Earth International, and bring them to the table and remind all those people from the European Union who are in the negotiations that it is about those people that are affected right now. I hope this answers your question, but it is always important to work within these networks, and especially to make sure that every voice is heard.
Thank you so much, Nina. Asatve.
So, just answering the role of particularly banks and corporations. I mean, on one level, of course, there's action all of global civil society need to do, which is to demonstrate what real solidarity means, which is, of course, recognizing that it's government policies in the global north, it's our banks and corporations that are in the global north that are financing these fossil fuel expansion and these deadly projects. And so we've long argued that there should be a legal obligation on the City of London and other financial centres to meet the 1.5-degree target and tackle inequality, so that they're directing the right investments into the right places. At the moment, of course, we know that the City of London, our banks and our corporations continue to finance those, and those profits, of course, come back to rich developed countries. I want to just also very quickly on the G20 transition fossil fuels. Look, you know, when we talk about all of these multilateral fora, right, that are taking place all over. And I always say that the rich developed countries that love to play the seven-dimensional chess with us, dropping words in everywhere. This is the negotiation on climate. If the rich countries want to commit, put it into their NDCs here. Put a firm date on which they will end will have a phase out of fossil fuels. If they want developing countries to phase out fossil fuels, put in their NDCs the quantum, the finance. Put in their NDCs the technology transfers that are required for developing countries to be able to transition away from dirty fossil fuels. Put in their NDCs the decisions that they will make in terms of the fact that the global south develops the global north. We all know for every $1 that flows from the global north to the global south, $30 currently flow back to the global north. They can put all of those in, and then we won't need empty statements of the G20. We'll have real concrete action here.
Last 10 seconds, Colin.
Sorry. No, I'll close. I think really good answers there. I'll just say, on that international organization question as well, I think it is domestic campaigning in different places for that work in as many places as possible. In the US, we're part of a Fair Shares campaign. For the US specifically, we have to be making that clear at the global stage, but also working in capitals everywhere. And the other thing I'll say is we just put out a briefing called We Can Pay For It. As Assad has said, I'll close this with, there is plenty of public money available for this transition, trillions and trillions of dollars. Right now it's being spent on endless wars. It's being spent propping up the profits of fossil fuel companies. That is money that needs to be redirected to the climate finance and the climate debt owed by the global north to the global south.
Thank you so much. This is the end of our press conference. Thank you.